The climate justice movement is a movement that says we're worried about our future. What future? What future? Children in the African continent, in Asia, in Latin America, they don't have a future. They don't have a present. They're not worried about the future. They're worried about their present. Your slogan is, we're worried about the future. What future? That's a middle-class bourgeois Western slogan. You got to be worried about now.
Yes, I'm here for...
Okay. We've been knowing you for a long time, since your speech at COP26, and people are very curious, like what happened afterwards.
I'm 54 years old. I've been doing this kind of thing for about 35 years. I've written about almost 40 books, thousands of articles. I've said similar things over the years. It takes one 5-minute clip in Glasgow to suddenly go, as they say, viral. Now, the question is, why does it go viral? There's no logic, I don't think you can understand that. But I do feel like the reaction has been very strong. And part of the reaction, if I can be quite straightforward, is that I think a lot of people are pretty fed up with the attitude, the ruling elites in the West regarding the rest of the world. I think people are pretty fed up. Even this conflict on Ukraine, it's so clear that Boris Johnson is in the middle of a domestic problem. He is being accused in his own parliament of lying to parliament. And rather than deal directly with his malfeasance, his perhaps lying to parliament, it's a very serious charge in a parliamentary democracy. Rather than deal with the fact that he has failed his country in terms of COVID, the economy, Brexit, and so on, he's out there in Kiev rattling the saber, saying, Putin must go withdraw his troops. Now, most people around the world see this and they think, good God, solve your own problems first. Secondly, don't exaggerate the issue in Eurasia. It's the same kind of thing. They use this word aggression, Russian aggression or Chinese aggression and so on. Who is the aggressor here? It's so obvious now when you have, say, US, German, British warships in the South China Sea. You don't have any Chinese warships in Long Island Sound, off the coast of New York City, but you have US warships. And yet the suffocation of information is such that they'll say, well, China is an aggressor, or China and India have failed to meet their targets with carbon. All of this, it's just, there's a tipping point, when people just feel like, look, I've had enough of this, okay? I don't want to have this any longer. And I feel that may have been part of it.
My observation is on two sides. Reflection by the audience are totally different. The Chinese side got like 3 million viewers and with almost like 99% of applause for you. But on probably Reddit, people basically think you're being aggressive. For those who think, this guy makes some sense, they would argue that there's no change that you can make. I feel the same when I use, here's what, according to UN Charter and what you scientists say, like, look, here's what per capita carbon dioxide emission they allow China for next, like, let's say 100 years. How dare you, if I quote Sunberg, how do you comment on someone, the criticism, those chosen developing countries, for example, India or China, were granted the privilege to be factories by the West? It's fair and reasonable to call it even, since modern world trade system compensated leading developing countries, for example, India or China, for white settler colonial atrocities ever since.
Look, in 1984, I was a young student and there was an explosion at an US owned factory in Bhopal in India. Company Union Carbide. It was a disaster. The factory exploded essentially. 3,000 people died pretty immediately. Many thousands were impacted and many died later. A lot of them not recorded as Union Carbide deaths. That took place. The factory, the owner knew that this was a ticking time bomb. They knew that really terrible situation, that there was going to be an explosion of some kind. They knew this. Yet they did nothing about it. They didn't care. But what struck me was, years later, I read a statement made by the head of another chemical company in the United States, American Cyanamid. The head of American Cyanamid said something. He said that it's terrible what happened in India. It's an accident. It's not an accident. If you know something's going to happen and it happens, it's not an accident. Anyway, he says terrible what happened in India, but he said they have a different attitude to life. In other words, if 3,000 Indians die, it doesn't matter. Every Western life is really is precious. Every Indian life is disposable. Well, they have ideas like reincarnation and whatever it is. Their lives are not precious. This idea that the life of people in India are not precious is important, because what happens when you believe that is then you can construct a world economic system that relies on the suppressed wages of people in a place like India. You don't have to actually pay them up to European wage standards. You can suppress their wages for 1,000 years. It doesn't matter, because you say, well, what will they do with their money? After all, their children don't need to be educated. They don't need to eat fully. They're okay with a bit of wheat in a ball with water and some salt and a chili. It's called satwa. It's what a lot of people eat. I mean, this is the attitude. And this attitude is actually, it should not be taken for granted. We welcome China into the world, they said. When Deng Xiaoping went to meet Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, and they had a conversation, and Lee Kuan Yew said, you've got to really up your game because you're going to go into stagnation and so on. And it's interesting. That conversation is very interesting. Deng Xiaoping, then the leadership in China decided, well, let's open up this place in Shenzhen, let's free trade zone. Western capital said, great, we're coming. We love China. We love China. As long as China subordinates its labor and allows its labor to be delivered to the advantage of Western companies, it's all fine. See, the problem comes when the Chinese leadership says Chinese firms are also starting to take off. At that time, Chinese firms start to take off. ZTE, Huawei, and so on, and many others start to take off. And then Western firms will say, oh, wait a minute. It was okay when China delivered labor to Western capital. But if you're going to have your own firms and you're going to increase the quality of the compensation for your labor, if, in other words, you're going to improve the standard of living of people, you're going to lift them out of poverty, that's unacceptable. That's actually unacceptable. They said, well, we'll move our factories to India. The problem is you can't do that, and we can talk about that later. There's a problem with moving to India. It's not that easy. There's this underlying attitude in the world system which says that there are precious lives, and the precious lives are in Europe and in the United States and so on. And then there are disposable lives. And I want to say that this is not necessarily quote unquote racist, because let's say a Chinese American migrant in the United States will be treated as a precious life to some extent. You see, to some extent.
Well, kind of doubt that. China, we just had an Asian, sister got stabbed in New York, and there's no BLM and stuff. There's no parade, no nothing.
That's why I said up to a certain extent. Up to a certain extent. I'm very clear, up to a certain extent, that if you're a migrant, because it's people who are US citizens or European citizens of different countries that get advantaged by the system. Now, up to a certain extent, because if you're a dissident and you create problems, you can get it in the neck. If you look Chinese at a time of anti-China propaganda, or when the temperature, if you look Chinese, you see, this look Chinese is important, because in the 1980s, when the anti-Japan thing was big in the United States, there was a Chinese American by the name of Vincent Chin who was beaten to death in Detroit. He looked Japanese, quote unquote.
It's the same, pretty much the same. Yeah.
So the point I want to make is, up to a certain point, you're protected. But if you're outside the zone of the West, if you're in Zambia, if you're in India, if you're in Cambodia, your life is not seen as precious. And I think that's a point I would like people to really digest, this difference between precious life and disposable life.
Well, I'd like to make a point here to my audience and to our audience here. There is a time since when the Western world, probably we're talking about US here, treating their, we call population precious. Because I spend most of my time in the US in Boston. And in Boston, there is this sugar factory. Syrup just blow up. Fire department been warning them for times and time. They'd be, I don't care about that. It's okay and stuff. Explosion caused like hundreds of people just drawn in the syrup. They spent like 2 months cleaning the streets filled with syrup. It's Boston, like pure, if they call it libertard camp. It's not like they care about American life as precious as what we are right now. And I would like to mention Tuskegee, MIT, and Harvard collaboration on the Science Club, radioactive biscuits, atrocity in Iraq, CIA, and how they actually concealed from what we count on, for example, the UN structure. That's a question I would like to point out. WHO actually sent a news piece out saying like developed countries are exporting medical toxic trash to India. Possibly if China is not keeping an eye on them, they're trying to exporting to China. When we're talking about vaccine apartheid or drug apartheid or patent apartheid, neglecting the fact that even when we're not talking about that level high stuff, the developed countries are treating developing countries as their trash can. In that sense, when they're saying like, oh, the allowance for you to join the World Trade System is compensating for white settler colonial atrocity, is totally nonsense.